Have you ever had to make a decision so big it felt like there was just no going back?
Oh, yeah,
A
absolutely.
decision that could, like, change everything.
Yeah.
That's kind of what Julius Caesar faced back in 49 BC at the Rubicon River.
It really is such a fascinating moment in history, isn't it? I mean, this one event, this one choice changed everything. And Tom Holland, in his book Rubicon, he really brings that moment to life, you
Mm.
know?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're diving into today. The story of Caesar, the fall of the Roman Republic, and what it all means for us all these years later.
You know, when you hear ancient Rome, you might think dusty old history, but Holland really makes a strong case that this period is actually shockingly relevant to us today.
Okay, so let's set the scene a little bit for our listeners. It's 49 BC. What's going on? What's at stake for Caesar?
Okay, so picture this. Caesar's legions, fresh off of victories in Gaul, they're all lined up at the Rubicon River.
Yep.
This river, it marked the boundary between Gaul and Italy. And crossing it with an army, big no-no, forbidden under Roman law. But at the same time, Caesar's political enemies back in Rome, they're moving against him, trying to strip him of his command, basically end his career.
So he's trapped.
Totally trapped. Like, what does he do? Go back to Rome and face disgrace? Maybe even prosecution? Or does he defy the Senate and cross the Rubicon, knowing that would mean civil war? Talk about a dilemma, right? This is what's called Caesar's dies simiens, a moment of just excruciating decision.
Oh, wow. It's like when you're facing this fork in the road, but with the fate of an entire republic at stake.
Exactly.
So he crosses the Rubicon. What does Holland say about the impact of that?
So this wasn't just some kind of military maneuver. Holland argues that this was the beginning of the end for the Roman Republic, which at the time it was the last bastion of freedom in the entire Mediterranean world.
Wow.
And it ushered in an era of autocracy, with Caesar eventually becoming dictator for life.
It's a real cautionary tale about how power can shift, how republics can fall.
It really is.
It's just wild how one event could cause these huge ripple effects across history.
Yeah.
And Holland seems to be drawing a direct line from the fall of the Republic to our own democracies today, right?
Exactly. He's saying, look, this is how republics can fall apart, how power gets consolidated, and how we need to be vigilant about our freedoms. He wants us to see those parallels and understand that these aren't just ancient problems. These are human problems that we still face today.
Okay, so we need to be paying attention to this. But how do we even begin to understand something that happened so long ago? I mean, Holland talks about the challenges historians face when they try to piece together the past, right?
He does. He reminds us that we only have these limited sources, often written by the elite.
Oh, right.
It's like trying to put together a puzzle, but half the pieces are missing.
Yeah.
He's encouraging us to be critical thinkers, to question what we think we know, and to be aware of the biases in those sources.
So history is less about finding the absolute truth and more about interpretation.
You got it.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's try to get a sense of life in ancient Rome. Holland paints a pretty vivid picture of their values and beliefs, some of which seem pretty strange to us today, especially when it comes to things like violence and conquest.
Yeah, I mean, it can be hard to wrap your head around it. Like, for the Romans, military victory, territorial expansion, even the brutality of gladiator games, those were sources of pride and entertainment. It's really different from our sensibilities today.
I mean, how could an entire society embrace that kind of brutality?
Well, Holland suggests that for Romans, those displays of power were a core part of their identity. They really believed in their own superiority, and their entire worldview was shaped by centuries of warfare and expansion.
Oh, wow.
They saw strength and military power as absolutely essential for survival.
So the more they were violent, the more they believed it was necessary, almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It's a pattern we see a lot throughout history, unfortunately.
Yeah, you're right. It's a good reminder that we need to understand the context of the past, even when parts of it are really unsettling to us today.
Absolutely. Judging the past only by our own morals can be really dangerous and misleading. It's about understanding what shaped people's actions, even if we don't agree with them.
Okay, so we've talked about the historical context and the challenges of interpreting the past. But what really draws people in and what Holland captures so well is that human drama at the heart of it all. These weren't just names in a history book. These were real people with ambitions, with flaws, and with these complex motivations.
He really does bring those figures to life. Cicero, Pompey, Cato, they become characters in this epic drama.
And he throws in some pretty fascinating details about Roman society, too, like their obsession with celebrity and spectacle.
Totally. Their lives were full of political intrigue scandals, these lavish parties, and of course the gladiatorial games. It was a society that thrived on drama and competition. They were obsessed with fame and fortune and power, just like people today.
It's like ancient Roman reality TV.
Uh-huh. Right.
But it reminds us that even though their times were different, they were driven by a lot of the same desires that we are.
Exactly, and that's why their stories still resonate with us. We see ourselves in their triumphs and their failures, and that's why it's so important to study history.
So what are some of those timeless lessons we can take away from the fall of the Roman Republic?
Well, one of the biggest is that we need to be vigilant about protecting democratic institutions. As we've been talking about, the Roman Republic didn't fall overnight. It was this gradual process. Things slowly eroded away at their government.
Right.
And the warning signs were there, but they were ignored or dismissed.
So what were some of those warning signs? What should we be looking out for today?
Well, one was that power was getting more and more concentrated in the hands of just a few people. As the Republic expanded military leaders, they gained so much wealth and influence that sometimes they were rivals to the Senate itself.
So unchecked ambition.
Exactly. And then you have this growing disconnect between the ruling class and the average people. The Roman elite became so focused on their own wealth and status, they lost touch with what everyday citizens needed.
That sounds familiar. We're seeing that in a lot of places today.
It's a pattern that happens over and over throughout history.
Yeah.
And finally, there's this issue of complacency, which we touched on a little bit earlier. The Roman people were tired of civil war and instability, so they were willing to give up some of their freedoms if it meant peace and security.
It makes sense. But at what cost, right? It seems like that's what Holland really wants us to think about. Are we making similar compromises today? Are we willing to trade our liberties for the illusion of safety or for strongman leadership?
Those are the tough questions that we all need to be asking ourselves. That's what's so brilliant about Holland's book. He makes us see those uncomfortable parallels between ancient Rome and our own world. He's not just telling us a story, he's making us think critically about our own societies.
It's like he's holding up a mirror, right? So as we kind of dig deeper into Rubicon, what other insights does Holland offer?
Well, one thing he really highlights is just how much of an impact Rome had a lasting legacy. He argues that their ideas, their institutions had a huge impact on Western civilization, and they continue to shape us today, even now.
Okay, that's a big statement. Give us some examples. How did Rome influence us exactly?
Well, think about it. The concept of a republic, a system where power is with the people and it's exercised through these elected representatives, that was a huge shift from the monarchies that were everywhere back then, and it became the model for so many democracies.
So the Roman Republic was like a blueprint for us.
Exactly. And then there's Roman law, the idea of due process equality before the law, the separation of powers. Those were revolutionary ideas back then, and they were hugely influential in shaping legal systems throughout Europe and even beyond.
Wow. So these Roman ideas, they went beyond just time and geography.
They really did. And you can't forget about the impact on language and literature, art, architecture, the Latin language, the writings of people like Virgil and Cicero, those massive Roman buildings like the Colosseum. All of that has such a profound impact on Western culture.
It's amazing to think that even though Rome fell so long ago, its legacy is still all around us.
And that's what makes Rubicon so powerful. It connects us to the past, helps us understand the present, and makes us think about the future.
So it's like Holland saying we're all Romans in a way.
Yeah, you could say that. We're all part of this historical story, and understanding that story is key to understanding who we are.
That's kind of a humbling thought, isn't it? It makes you realize we're building on what came before. But it also makes you wonder, what will our legacy be? What will future generations say about us?
That's the big question, isn't it? Will we be seen as the heirs to the Roman Republic, upholding its values and ideals? Or will we be the ones who caused its downfall, repeating the mistakes of the past?
That's something for all of us to think about. Tom Holland's Rubicon is a really powerful and timely reminder that history isn't just about the past, it's about understanding the present and shaping the future.
It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand what democracies are facing today and to learn from the successes and failures of those who came before us.
Okay, so we've explored the historical context, the challenges of interpreting the past, and the lasting legacy of Rome. But there's one more key element we need to talk about, the human element.
Yes, because at the end of the day, history is a story about people. And Rubicon is full of these really interesting characters whose choices shaped everything.
And obviously Caesar's the main figure here. But Holland doesn't just show him as this power-hungry conqueror, right?
No, not at all. He paints a much more complex picture of Caesar. He acknowledges his ambition and his ruthlessness, but also highlights his charisma, how brilliant he was as a military strategist, and how popular he was with the Roman people.
It's interesting how history can sometimes turn these complex people into simple heroes or villains. But Holland reminds us that they were real people with both good and bad qualities.
Exactly. And by looking at how complex Caesar was as a person, it helps us understand the complex times he lived in.
So let's dive into Caesar's story a bit more. What were some of the key events that led to his rise to power?
Well, his early career, it was full of political maneuvering and military victories. He rose through the ranks, gaining influence and popularity. But along the way, he made some powerful enemies. And then his conquests in Gaul, which we talked about before, they solidified his reputation as a military leader. But they also made some people back in Rome pretty nervous about how powerful he was becoming.
So it's kind of a mixed bag. Success on the battlefield made him famous, but it also made him a threat to the Roman elite.
Exactly. And that tension eventually led to that whole standoff at the Rubicon.
And that's where the Decemans comes in again,
Yeah.
right? That crucial moment when he had to decide.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that Caesar wasn't just this power-hungry guy who wanted to destroy the Republic. He really believed that he was doing what was best for Rome. He thought the Republic was falling apart, riddled with corruption, and just not working. And he believed that he was the only one who could fix it and bring back order and stability.
So he saw himself as kind of savior.
In a way, yeah. And a lot of Romans agreed with him. They were tired of all the political fighting and the economic problems and the threat of violence. They just wanted a strong leader who could bring peace and prosperity.
And Caesar was ready to be that leader. But as we know, his rise to power meant the end of the Republic. And that brings up some big questions for us today, doesn't it?
It really does. It makes you wonder, are we any less likely to fall for the appeal of a strongman leader, especially when times are tough or uncertain? Do we care more about stability and security than we do about freedom and democracy? These are questions that every generation has to face.
It's like history's giving us a warning, showing us that even the strongest institutions can collapse if we're not careful. And it all comes back to that one decision, that moment at the Rubicon. It changed the course of history, and it still speaks to us today.
It really shows how powerful individual choices can be.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that we can learn a lot from the past, even in our complicated and ever-changing world.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the Roman Republic. We've talked about the history, the challenges of interpreting the past, the legacy of Rome, and the lessons we can learn from it all. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that history is not just about dates and names. It's about understanding the things that shape our world, how humans behave, and how the choices we make can have an impact for generations to come. And Rubicon is such a great exploration of all of that.
It's definitely a book that sticks with you. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Roman Republic, be sure to check out Rubicon by Tom Holland. It's a fascinating journey through history. It's also very relevant to our lives today. And be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the past, present, and future. Thanks for listening.